They left her for dead. But they made one mistake. They thought the story ended there, in the cold mud of a forgotten creek bed. They were wrong. This is the story of what happens when the forgotten refuse to be erased. It's a story about a woman left with nothing, a man who had already lost everything, and the family they built not from blood, but from silence and fire. The wind on Smoke Ridge had a voice. Not a human voice, you understand. It was older than that. It spoke in rattles of shale and whispers through sun-bleached pine. And that morning, it was telling Tohano that something was wrong. He knelt in the red dirt, his knuckles caked with it, a burlap sack half full of bitter roots beside him. For years, this ridge had been his only companion. It had taken his family, his tribe, his name. All he had left was the silence. But today, the silence was broken. Not by a sound, but by a feeling. A deep, gut-level shudder in the earth itself. The kind of feeling that comes right before the lightning strikes, or right before a life changes forever. He stood up, slow, his back straight as an arrow shaft. His eyes, dark and deep-set, scanned the horizon, and that's when he saw it. Down in the arroyo, a flicker of white against the red rock. It wasn't natural. It was the color of surrender, of canvas, of bone. A wagon, overturned, wrecked. No horses, no people. He didn't run. Panic was a luxury he'd given up long ago. He moved with the quiet purpose of a hunter, his feet finding sure holds on the crumbling slope. The smell hit him first. Not death, not yet. Something worse. The smell of spoiled hope, iron, whiskey, and the faint, sweet scent of milk turning sour in the cold air. He reached the creek bed and saw the full picture. The wagon was a skeleton, its ribs splintered, one wheel shattered like a broken promise. Scavengers had already been and gone, leaving scattered feathers and ripped open crates. But his eyes weren't on the wagon. They were on the shape huddled beside it. A woman, half buried in mud, her hair matted with blood and dirt. She was so still, she could have been another rock, another fallen log. But then he saw the faintest puff of condensation leave her lips. And then he saw the bundle clutched in her arms. The bundle moved. A tiny, pathetic whimper escaped the cloth, a sound so small the wind almost carried it away. Tohano knelt, his shadow falling over her face. Her eyelids fluttered, cracked and dry. A voice, brittle as a dead leaf, rasped from her throat. "I ain't dead." He studied her for a long moment, his face impossible to read. "No," he said, his own voice rough from disuse. "Not yet." Her eyes opened fully then. Green, but a broken green, like sea glass worn down by a merciless tide. "They left me," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "They left us." He looked from her face to the bundle she clutched like it was the last anchor in the world. With a hand surprisingly gentle for its callous state, he pulled back a corner of the blanket. Inside were two infants, twins, so small, so fragile. One was squirming weakly, its face a red, crumpled mask. The other was terrifyingly still, its lips tinged with blue. He leaned in close, listening, waiting. He felt it more than heard it. A breath. Faint, shallow, but there. Life, clinging on by a thread. He looked at her, one eyebrow raised in a silent question. She just shook her head, a tear cutting a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "No one else would," she managed to say. "No one." He didn't need to ask what happened. The land told the story. The sharp, panicked angle of the wagon tracks. The hoof prints of a single horse, ridden hard and fast away from the wreck. The broken branches downhill, snapped not by a storm, but by men in a hurry, men who didn't care what they trampled. They had crashed the wagon and left her to the elements, to the animals, to fate. But they hadn't counted on him. Without a word, he gently took the babies from her arms. He tucked them inside his coat, one against each side of his chest, their tiny bodies barely making a lump. The warmth of his skin was the first kindness they had likely ever known. Then he bent down and slid his arms under the woman. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, but she was impossibly light. As light as dry grass, as a bag of bones. Her body was a testament to starvation and hardship. "Josie," she mumbled, her head lolling against his shoulder as consciousness began to slip away. My name is Josie. He started the long climb back up the ridge, his steps slow and certain. I don't need your name, he said softly, more to himself than to her. I just need your will to live. The ridge watched them go, silent and ancient. It had taken so much from this man, but today, for reasons no one could ever understand, it had given something back. And Tohano didn't know yet if it was a gift or just another test. Another reason to feel the pain of loss all over again. His home wasn't a house. It was a scar in the side of the ridge, a lean-to dug into the earth, reinforced with stone and roofed with brush and packed clay. It was invisible from a distance, hidden by a stand of gnarled pines. Inside, a fire pit held glowing coals, and a spring trickled nearby, a lifeline in this harsh land. He laid Josie down on a pile of wool blankets near the hearth. Her breathing was shallow, a ragged wheeze that spoke of a coming fever. He stoked the embers, adding dried cedar until a steady warmth began to push back the cold. The babies, still tucked in his coat, began to stir, their tiny lips puckering, their fists trembling like autumn leaves. He knew he had to work fast. He found a horn cup, poured in a little goat's milk from a skin bag, and warmed it by the fire. He fed them drop by drop. They drank with a desperate, primal hunger. They were starving. Josie must have had nothing to give them for days. She tossed in her sleep, moaning a name he couldn't make out. Her hand twitched, reaching for the children even in her delirium. He placed them beside her, wrapped in a deerskin, and watched. He didn't sleep that night. He sat outside the entrance of the lean-to, a bone knife in his hand, whittling a piece of cedar. The slivers fell at his feet like wooden teardrops. He thought of his wife, shot down under a flag of truce. He thought of his son, taken by the coughing sickness in the reservation camp. He thought of his people, whose bones were buried beneath the red hill the army now called Fort Avery. Ghosts. They were all ghosts now. He was supposed to be a ghost too. Alone, silent, waiting for the wind to finally claim him. And yet, inside the shelter, two tiny hearts were beating. A woman was fighting her way back from the edge of the grave. The fire crackled, a defiant spark against the immense, star-dusted darkness. The ridge had tried to strip him bare, to take everything until he was nothing but memory and bone. But tonight it had thrown a new fragile weight into his hands. He closed his eyes, the scent of cedar sharp in the cold air. Was this mercy, or was it just the universe finding a new, more creative way to make him suffer? He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that for the first time in years, the silence of the ridge felt a little less empty. The storm hit 2 nights later, a cold, stubborn rain that turned the dust to a thick, red paste. The wind howled through the pines, sounding like grieving mothers. Inside the lean-to, the air grew heavy and damp. Josie's fever spiked. She shivered violently, her skin burning to the touch, her moans turning into incoherent whispers. Tohano worked tirelessly. He brewed a bitter tea from sage, pine bark, and a pinch of cedar ash. He tried to get her to drink, holding a clay cup to her cracked lips. She wouldn't take it. She thrashed, her eyes wild with suspicion even in her fevered state. I'm not going to poison you, he said, his voice low and steady. If I wanted you dead, I would have left you for the coyotes. Sometime after midnight, her eyes cleared for a moment. She looked at the cup, then at his unreadable face. She coughed, a dry, rattling sound. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. You don't look like a man with a plan. He tilted his head. Looks can lie. She took the cup. She sipped, grimaced, but she drank. The warmth seemed to settle her. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the only sounds the snapping of the fire and the soft, bird-like noises of the sleeping twins. What are their names? He asked, his voice barely disturbing the quiet. She stared into the fire, her gaze distant. She didn't answer. He didn't ask again. He understood. A name was a claim. A name was a hope. And maybe she didn't have any hope left to give. Days blurred into a rhythm of survival. Tohano would hunt and forage. Josie would tend to the babies, her movements growing stronger, less shaky. Her fever broke, leaving her weak but clear-headed. They existed in a world without words. He would leave a pile of firewood by the door. She would leave a bowl of boiled roots by the fire. It was a language of action, of shared existence. One morning she watched him trying to balance the horn cup of milk on two rocks over the fire. It tipped, spilling into the flames with a hiss. A quiet, unexpected laugh escaped her lips. He didn't smile, but she saw the corner of his eye crinkle. It was the first crack in the wall of silence between them. Later that day, as they sat side by side watching the mist burn off the valley below, he spoke. "Your children," he said, not as a question, but a statement. She hesitated. Her eyes flicked to the babies, sleeping peacefully. "One is," she said, her voice quiet but firm. His, his mother, she was my friend." Tohano waited, his stillness an invitation to continue. "Her name was Clara," Josie said, her voice thick with emotion. "She worked for my husband's family. They didn't treat her right. There was a fire in the stables. They left her behind. Called it an accident." She took a ragged breath. "I couldn't leave her boy. I just couldn't. So I took them both when I ran." He nodded slowly, processing this new piece of the story. It wasn't just abandonment. It was something darker, something rooted in cruelty. "So they're both yours now," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. She looked at him, surprised. "That doesn't bother you? That one of them isn't my blood?" He picked up a piece of flint and began to work it with a smaller stone, his hands steady as the river that carved this canyon. "I've seen men kill for owning a piece of dirt," he said without looking up. "I've seen them kill for pride, for a colored ribbon, for nothing at all. I have never seen a man kill for too much love." She didn't know what to say to that. She just watched his powerful hands, shaping stone, creating an edge where there was none. And she realized this man didn't see the world in lines of blood and ownership. He saw it in terms of survival and strength, in a quiet, brutal kind of honor. That night she found the courage to ask him, "What happened to your family?" He stopped his work. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. He looked toward the dark mouth of the shelter, as if seeing ghosts in the night. "Fort Avery," he said, the name dropping like a stone into a deep well. 1870. She knew the name. Everyone in this territory had heard the whispers. A band of Apache, camped under a flag of peace, slaughtered in the night by soldiers. An official report called it a battle. The whispers called it a massacre. "How did you survive?" and she asked, her voice barely audible. "I wasn't there," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "I was guiding a survey crew 3 days south, looking for silver." He paused, the irony thick enough to taste. "I came back to bones and silence." Josie closed her eyes, a wave of second-hand grief washing over her. "I'm sorry." He stood up and stirred the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the dark. He didn't want pity. Pity was useless. It couldn't bring back the dead. The first time their hands touched, it was an accident. She was passing him one of the babies, and their fingers brushed. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. He didn't pull away, but he didn't meet her eyes either. He just took the child and began to hum. A low, guttural, wordless melody. A rhythm that sounded as old as the rocks around them. "Is that a song from your tribe?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "From my mother. She said it keeps the wind from stealing a baby's breath." Josie watched him, this man of deep sorrows and quiet strengths. He was a ghost, living in a tomb of his own making. But he was humming a lullaby to a child that was not his, in a home he had built for one that now held three. For the first time since the wagon crashed, she didn't feel like a burden he had been forced to carry. She felt like something else, something he had chosen to save, and she wondered, with a terrifying flicker of hope, what that might mean. On the 9th day, the wind changed again. It wasn't a weather change. It was a scent, faint but sharp, unmistakable. Wood smoke, but not their cedar fire. This was thicker, greasier, the smell of a cook fire, the smell of men, and something else, the smell of polished leather and oiled steel. Tohano smelled it first. He rose in one fluid motion, leaving the arrowhead he was crafting, and moved to the edge of the ridge. He stood there, motionless, a silhouette against the pale morning sky, sniffing the air like a wolf. Josie's heart began to pound against her ribs. She didn't have to ask. She knew. Riders? She whispered. Maybe, he said, his voice a low rumble. Or someone is camping close. How close? He turned his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the plains below. Too close. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over her. She looked down at the two infants sleeping peacefully, ignorant of the danger that rode on the wind. Her jaw tightened. You think it's them? Tohano didn't answer. He didn't have to. The grim set of his mouth said it all. The past wasn't finished with her yet. It was coming to reclaim its property. That night he didn't whittle. He didn't rest. He sat by the fire, a rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness. Josie watched him from her sleeping mat. His stillness was absolute, but it was the stillness of a coiled snake, not of peace. Do you always do that? She asked into the quiet. Stay up all night when danger's near? He didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the path leading up to their sanctuary. No, he said. Only when I have something worth guarding. Her breath caught in her throat. Something worth guarding. He wasn't talking about the lean-to or his meager supplies. He was talking about them, about her, about the boys. In that moment, something shifted inside her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was mixed with something else, a fierce, defiant resolve. They had left her for dead, but she wasn't dead, and she had found a reason to fight. 2 days passed in suffocating tension. The air felt tight, like a drum skin stretched to the breaking point. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a hawk, made Josie jump. On the third morning, Tohano saddled the old grizzled mule he kept tethered in a small canyon. I'll be back before sundown, he told her, his voice leaving no room for argument. I need supplies. What if you're not? She asked, the fear leaking into her voice. He finally met her gaze, and his eyes were like dark flint. Then wait one more day. If I'm not back by then, take the path behind the spring. It leads west. Don't stop until you reach the mountains. He returned at dusk, the mule laden with a few precious goods: flour, salt, a small keg of black powder, and a bolt of canvas. He slid off the mule's back, his face grim. No riders, he said, anticipating her question. But the trail isn't clean. Someone passed through after us. Wagon ruts, already starting to fade. They're looking. He paused, then reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a small, clumsily wrapped parcel. He handed it to her. Inside was a spool of blue thread and a simple ribbon, stitched with tiny white flowers. She stared at it, confused. I saw it at the trading post, he said gruffly, avoiding her eyes. Thought it might help. Help what? He shrugged, a barely perceptible movement of his shoulders. Remind you that you're not a ghost. She pressed her lips together, fighting back a sudden, sharp wave of emotion. It was the first gift she had received in years. A simple ribbon, but it was more than that. It was a thread of hope, a splash of color in a world of gray and red rock. Later that evening, after she washed her hair in the cold spring water, she used it to tie her hair back. Her hands, she noticed, were steady. They sat by the fire, the babies gurgling between them. The silence was comfortable now, a shared blanket against the world. Back in Amarillo, she said suddenly, poking the fire with a stick. My husband's father, he used to say a woman's worth was measured by two things: how well she could keep her mouth shut and how many sons she could put in his cradle. Tohano looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He told me I talked too much, she added with a bitter smile. What did you believe? He asked quietly. She watched the embers glow. I believed my worth had nothing to do with my mouth or my belly, but I never had anyone to say it out loud to. He looked from her to the sleeping children, then back to her. His eyes seemed to soften. You do now. And she knew he meant it. Later that night, the wind picked up, howling a lonely song across the ridge. Tohano stood at the edge of the hollow watching the darkness. This time Josie went and stood beside him. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a silent two-person army against the night. Below them the world was dark and empty, but they both knew it wouldn't stay that way. Whatever's coming, she said, her voice steady. We can't outrun it. No, he agreed, his gaze never wavering. But we can outlast it. That is the Apache way. She managed a small smile. Good, because I'm tired of running. The next morning she saw something new on the wall of the lean-to, carved into the stone above the fire pit. It was a symbol, a series of lines and circles, burned dark at the edges. What does it mean, she asked, tracing the deep groove with her finger. Tohano was checking the tension on a new snare he'd built. It's from the old language, before the white man's letters. He looked over his shoulder at the carving. It means safe place. She ran her hand over it again, the rough stone warm against her palm. Thank you, she whispered. He just nodded and went back to his work, but she felt it, a foundation being laid, not of stone and wood, but of something far, far stronger. They were no longer two strangers clinging to survival. They were a family defending their home. The mule brayed a warning before the sound of boots on gravel reached them. It was a nervous, broken sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Tohano was already at the edge of the ridge, a rifle held loosely in one hand, his posture relaxed but ready. Josie stepped out of the lean-to, a baby clutched tight in each arm. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face a mask of calm. 3 riders. They came up the trail slow, confident, like they owned the ground beneath their horses' hooves. The man in the lead wore a clean stovepipe hat and a wool coat, despite the growing warmth of the day. He had the soft hands of a man who paid others to do his dirty work. The second man was young, his eyes darting around nervously. The third, Josie's blood ran cold. Caleb Langford, her late husband's cousin, thin as a whip with a face like cured leather and a perpetual sneer that always made him look like he was smelling something foul. That him? Caleb asked, squinting up at Tohano. The man in the hat, Walter Sims, nodded. Josephine, he called out, his voice smooth and authoritative. We're here to take you home. Your family is worried sick. Josie stepped forward, her voice hard as the rock she stood on. My family tried to kill me. Sims held up a placating hand. Now, a misunderstanding. A terrible accident. Caleb here feels just awful about it. Caleb laughed, a short, ugly bark. You think this is a home? He waved a dismissive hand at the lean-to, the rugged ridge. This patch of dirt is no place to raise Langford boys. Tohano's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent, a statue carved from the ridge itself. You left me to die, Josie said, her voice shaking with rage. You told the driver to cut the horse loose. You wanted us dead. Hysterical, Caleb scoffed. Always were. I'm standing right here, Caleb, she shot back. That's proof enough. Walter Sims cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Ma'am, let's be reasonable. The Langfords are offering you a home. The boys will have tutors, land, a name that matters. What can this man? He glanced at Tohano with disdain. Give them? Pine smoke and roasted squirrel? Tohano finally moved. He took one step forward, and the silence that followed was louder than a gunshot. The air grew thick, heavy. He looked down at the 3 men, not with anger, but with an ancient, weary contempt. I can give them breath, he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying easily on the wind. I can give them tomorrow. Can you? Sims's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Caleb spat on the ground. You'll regret this, you filthy squatter. Josie stepped up beside Tohano, presenting a united front. No, she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. You'll remember this. Every single morning when you look in the mirror, you'll see the face of a coward who was beaten by 1 woman, 2 babies, and a man with nothing left to lose. That hit its mark. A flash of pure fury crossed Caleb's face. He yanked his horse's reins, turning it so sharply the animal whinnied in protest. The young rider followed suit, eager to be away. Walter Sims lingered for a moment, his eyes memorizing the layout of the ridge, the paths, the shelter. It was a cold, calculating look, a look that promised this was not over. Then he too turned and rode away. The sound of their hooves faded, swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. Josie's legs finally gave out. She sank to the ground, her whole body trembling with adrenaline and rage. Tohano knelt by the fire pit, his movements calm and measured as he began to gather his tools. A knife, a hammer, coils of wire he'd stripped from the wrecked wagon. "They'll be back," she whispered. "Yes." "When?" "When they think we're not ready." He looked at her then, his dark eyes holding hers. "They're wrong." He didn't have to protect them. She had told him as much, but his answer silenced all her protests. "They believe no one will," he had said. "That is why I must." In the days that followed, a quiet, furious energy settled over the hollow. They worked from sunup to sundown, transforming their shelter into a defense. Tohano, using knowledge passed down through generations of warriors, turned the ridge into a trap. He dug pits lined with sharpened stakes, hidden beneath a thin layer of brush. He rigged snares using river stones and rawhide that could snap a man's leg. He showed Josie which plants were poison, which rocks would crumble under a man's weight. She was a quick learner. She carried water, mixed clay, and helped him haul rocks into place. She learned to load the rifle, her hands no longer shaking. She was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow to fall. She was a defender, a warrior, a mother protecting her young. One evening she found him sharpening a flint arrowhead, the fading sunlight glinting off the stone. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that a man had to ask, had to kneel and make promises, give a woman his name." He kept working, his focus absolute. "But now," she continued, "I think maybe you just stay, and that's enough." He paused, glancing at her. He gave the barest of nods. "Then I'm staying," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. That night, the first snow of the season began to fall, fat, silent flakes drifting down from a gray sky. They moved the baby's sleeping mat closer to the fire. Josie laid another blanket over them, then sat down beside Tohano. She sat close enough that their shoulders touched. He didn't reach for her. She didn't lean into him. They just sat there, breathing in rhythm, two solitary figures finding warmth in a cold, hostile world. Outside, the wind didn't howl. It sighed like something that had finally learned how to rest. And in that shared silence, a promise was made. A promise stronger than any words, more binding than any law. They would stand together, they would endure, or they would fall together. But they would not be broken. The fire wouldn't catch. Tohano tried 3 times, his practiced hands cupping flint and steel, coaxing a spark into a nest of dry tinder. Each time the kindling would smoke, glow a hopeful red, and then die with a pathetic sigh. He sat back on his heels, a muscle twitching in his jaw. It was a bad omen. Behind him, Josie rocked the twins. One of them was coughing, a dry, shallow hack that tore at her heart. The storm was coming, not one of rain and wind. Something far worse. It came at mid-morning, the distant, rhythmic drumming of hooves. Not 3 riders this time, a dozen. Maybe more. They weren't trying to be quiet. This wasn't a visit. It was an invasion. Tohano moved to the ridge, the rifle across his back, the bone knife at his hip. He didn't stand tall or make a show of defiance. He just existed, as much a part of the ridge as the ancient pines. Caleb was at the center of the posse, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. He had brought hired guns this time, hard-faced men with cold eyes and rifles held at the ready. Walter Sims was there too, holding a sheet of paper like a weapon. "We're not here for a fight," Caleb called out, though the men arrayed behind him made that a clear lie. "I have a writ," Sims shouted, his voice high and reedy, "signed by a judge in Amarillo. It names the Langford family as the rightful guardians of the children. It declares their mother, Josephine Langford, unfit and mentally unstable." Tohano gestured for the paper. One of the younger riders brought it up part of the way, leaving it on a rock. Tohano read it, his face showing no expression, then let the wind take it. The paper fluttered away like a dead leaf. "That paper doesn't matter here," Sims shrieked, his composure cracking. "Paper doesn't keep children warm at night," Tohano replied, his voice a low growl. Caleb spurred his horse forward. "This is your last chance, squaw man. Hand over the boys or we'll come up there and burn you out." Josie appeared at Tohano's side, her face pale but resolute. "You left me for dead," she screamed down at them, her voice raw with fury. "You murdered my friend Clara. You threw us away like garbage. You don't get to rewrite the story now." You're hysterical, Caleb yelled back. Just like the judge said. Tohano spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. Take one more step up this trail, and you will find out what else I have buried in this ridge besides memories. The hired guns hesitated, looking at each other. This wasn't what they'd signed up for. But then one of them, eager to impress Caleb, raised his rifle and fired a shot into the air. That was all it took. Tohano didn't charge. He melted back from the ridgeline, pulling Josie with him, back toward the lean-to, back toward the defenses he had so painstakingly prepared. The battle for Smoke Ridge had begun. They came at dusk, thinking the fading light would give them cover. They were wrong. Tohano knew this land in the dark better than they knew it in broad daylight. He had walked every inch of it, his bare feet learning the language of the earth. Two men crept up a narrow side path. The first one's boot came down on a patch of innocent-looking leaves. There was a sickening crack as the ground gave way, and he fell into a shallow pit, a sharpened elk bone driving clean through his thigh. His scream was high and animalistic, echoing through the canyon. The second man turned and fled, crashing through the brush in a blind panic. From the camp below, there were shouts of confusion and anger. The hired guns were no longer so confident. The ridge had teeth. Inside the lean-to, Josie held the sick baby to her chest, trying to soothe his ragged breathing. I'm not scared for me, she whispered to Tohano in the darkness. I'm scared I'll survive this and have to be alone again. He crouched by the entrance, a silhouette against the dying light. You won't be alone. You don't know that. He reached over and took her hand. His grip was firm, solid, an anchor in the storm. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she let herself cry. Not loud, racking sobs, but silent, hot tears that fell onto his hand like rain on stone. They waited for 2 days. The posse below didn't leave, but they didn't attack either. They were trying to starve them out, to break their will. On the third night, they heard movement. Not a full charge, but a few men, trying to sneak up under the cover of a moonless sky. The footsteps grew closer. A branch cracked. Then a voice, small and trembling. Josie! She froze. She knew that voice. She stood up, her heart pounding. Tohano moved to block the entrance, knife in hand. It's me, the voice said, closer now. Levi. Josie pushed past Tohano. There, standing in the shadows, was Caleb's youngest brother, a boy of 17, all gangly limbs and terrified eyes. He was holding a burlap sack. I didn't know, he stammered, not looking at her. I swear I didn't know what Caleb did until they came back without you. I didn't believe it. He looked up, his face streaked with tears. But seeing him now, how crazy he is for those boys. I believe it. He held out the sack. I brought food and medicine for the baby. Tohano took the sack, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. They're planning to set fire to the base of the ridge at dawn, Levi whispered, his words tumbling out in a rush. Try and smoke you out. Caleb, he doesn't care who gets hurt. He just wants the boys. He swallowed hard. I can't be like him. I don't want to be like him. Then he turned and melted back into the darkness, a ghost of a boy trying to outrun his family's shadow. Inside, Josie opened the sack. There was bread, dried meat, and a small bottle of laudanum, enough to help the baby breathe easier. They're scared, she whispered, looking at Tohano. Good, he said, his voice grim. Fear makes men honest. She looked at him, at his strong profile illuminated by the faint glow of the embers. I think I loved you, she said, the words feeling strange and new on her tongue. Before I even knew your name. He stirred the fire, a small, thoughtful gesture. I think, he answered, his voice soft. I was waiting for you, even before I heard the wagon crash. At sunrise, the camp below was gone. No smoke, no riders, no threats. Just the profound, ringing silence of peace. Levi's desertion must have broken what was left of their morale. Or maybe, just maybe, a sliver of conscience had found its way into their dark hearts. Later that morning, Josie took the blue ribbon Tohano had given her and tied it to a pine branch above the door of their lean-to. It was a splash of color against the stone, a fragile flag of victory, a sign not of surrender, but of a home that had been defended, a family that had refused to break. Spring didn't arrive on Smoke Ridge. It seeped in. It softened the frozen ground, coaxed timid green shoots from the red earth, and changed the song of the wind from a mournful howl to a hopeful whisper. The lean-to had survived the winter, and so had they. The fear was gone, replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of building a life. Tohano no longer rose with the sun to stand watch. He rose to work. He cleared a small patch of land behind the shelter, hauling away rocks, turning the soil. Josie, with one baby strapped to her back and the other sleeping on a blanket nearby, planted seeds. Wild onion, hardy beans, tough greens she'd learned to identify from Tohano. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. A garden born from a battlefield. The boys, who she now called Jesse and Cole, grew stronger every day. They were children of the ridge, their first sights the sweeping sky and the ancient rock, their first sounds the wind and Tohano's low humming lullabies. He carved a set of chimes for them from hollowed bone and scraps of tin, and their gurgling laughter as it tinkled in the breeze was a sound of pure, untainted joy. One afternoon, while searching for a flat stone to grind corn, Josie's fingers brushed against a loose rock near the fire pit. Behind it, tucked away in a small cavity, was a wooden box. It was old, the wood worn smooth with time. She opened it carefully. Inside lay three objects: a comb carved from bone, a single tarnished silver button, and a small piece of cloth embroidered with the symbol of a hawk. She knew, without having to ask, what they were: the last remnants of his other life, the last pieces of the family the world had taken from him. She brought the box to him where he sat at the edge of the ridge, sharpening his knife. "You kept these," she said softly. He didn't turn. "They were from before." "Your family?" He nodded once. "My mother. My sister." "I'm sorry," she whispered. He finally looked at her, and there was no pain in his eyes, only a deep, quiet acceptance. He tapped his chest with his fist. "They stay here. In me." Then he gestured toward the lean-to, toward the garden, toward the sound of the wind chimes. "And now, they are here too." She understood. His past was not a ghost that haunted him. It was a root that anchored him. And now she and the boys were a part of that root system. Later that night, as the twins slept peacefully between them, she asked a question that had been lingering in her mind. "Do you ever want to leave this ridge?" "I used to," he admitted, his gaze on the vast, star-filled sky. "I used to think it was my prison, but I was wrong. This ridge remembered me, even when I tried to forget it." He turned his hand over, palm up, a silent offering. She placed her hand in his. "I think," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "it remembered me too." A few weeks later, a traveling trader, following the scent of their smoke, found his way into their hollow. He was a grizzled old man with a pack mule and eyes that had seen too much. "Didn't expect to find folks living out here," he said, looking from Josie to Tohano and back again. "We didn't expect to be found," Josie replied with a small smile. The trader shared news from the world below. The Langford family was broken. Caleb, facing charges for the fire and the attack on the ridge thanks to Levi's testimony, had sold off his land to pay for lawyers. The family name was now spoken in whispers, a cautionary tale of greed and ruin. Justice, it turned out, sometimes found its way even to the most forgotten corners of the world. Before he left, the trader gave Josie a worn book of Psalms. Inside the front cover, in a shaky hand, someone had written a single line: "Let what is lost become seed." That evening, Tohano presented her with a gift. It was a ring carved from a piece of smooth white river bone. It was simple, imperfect, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He didn't ask her to marry him. He didn't make any grand declarations. He just slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They never spoke of vows. They never sought the blessing of a preacher or the sanction of a lawman. Their commitment had been forged in a crucible of fear and survival, and it was stronger than any piece of paper. The following spring, they built a second, larger shelter next to the first. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, a silent dance of partnership. They were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. One morning, Josie rose before the sun, and walked to the flat rock at the edge of their hollow. The sky was turning a soft, bruised purple. The air was cool and clean. She held Cole on one hip while Jessie slept soundly on her back. She looked out over the valley, at the world that had tried to crush her. She felt no fear, no anger, just a profound, quiet peace. She had been left for dead in the dirt, a broken woman with two unwanted children, but the ridge had caught her, a silent man had saved her. And together in this wild and lonely place, they had done something miraculous. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and built a home. Not a house of wood and stone, but a fortress of love and resilience. What mattered wasn't the blood you were born with, but the family you chose. What mattered wasn't the name you were given, but the life you built. What mattered was the fire and the quiet promise to keep it burning together against the coming darkness. If this story of survival and a family found in the most unlikely of places touched your heart, please help our community grow by hitting that like button. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss another story of hope from the forgotten corners of history. Thank you for listening.